"Move along, old man. This park isn't your personal dining room." The words cut through the quiet morning air just as the sun lifted above the row of maple trees lining Jefferson Park. A few early joggers slowed their pace, not because they wanted trouble, but because something about the moment felt tense in that subtle way people recognize before anyone says another word. Daniel Brooks stood beside a weathered green bench with a small paper bag in his hand, the kind bakeries use for fresh bread. At his feet, a cluster of gray pigeons shuffled and fluttered, their soft coos blending with the distant hum of traffic 3 blocks away. Daniel moved slowly, carefully pinching small crumbs between his fingers and letting them fall to the ground like quiet little snowflakes of bread. The birds trusted him. They always did. Every morning at exactly 7:10 a.m., he came to the same corner of the park, the same bench beneath the same maple tree, and the birds would gather as if they had memorized the rhythm of his footsteps. But today the rhythm broke when the patrol car rolled up along the curb with a low crunch of gravel. The engine idled for a moment before the door opened and Officer Tyler Grant stepped out, adjusting the radio clipped to his shoulder. Tyler was young, maybe 28, with the kind of stiff posture that came from new authority and a freshly pressed uniform. He scanned the park with a quick glance before his eyes landed on Daniel and the pigeons circling around his shoes. Something about the scene clearly annoyed him. He walked across the grass with deliberate steps, his boots leaving faint impressions in the dew. Daniel didn't look up right away. Instead, he dropped another small piece of bread, watching as one brave pigeon hopped closer and pecked at it. The bird tilted its head, studying him with bright, curious eyes. Daniel smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough to show a quiet warmth. Feeding the birds had become a ritual, something steady in a world that changed too quickly. But Officer Grant stopped a few feet away and folded his arms across his chest. "You hear me?" he said sharply. Daniel slowly straightened his back and turned his head. His expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, as if he had been expecting the interruption. The officer gestured toward the pigeons now scattering and circling in nervous loops above the grass. "You can't just stand here making a mess and attracting birds," Tyler continued. "People use this park." A breeze drifted through the branches overhead, carrying the faint smell of roasted coffee from a cafe across the street. Daniel brushed a few crumbs from his palm and glanced down at the birds returning cautiously to the ground. "I'm just feeding them," he said in a gentle voice that carried the weight of years, but none of the tension in the officer's tone. Tyler gave a short laugh, the kind people use when they think someone is being deliberately difficult. "Yeah, I can see that," he replied, stepping closer. "But you're not supposed to loiter here like this." Daniel studied the young officer for a moment. The sunlight caught the silver threads in Daniel's short gray hair and the deep lines around his eyes, marks of decades spent observing people rather than reacting to them. Around them, the park continued its quiet morning routine. A woman pushed a stroller along the path. A man tossed a tennis ball for his golden retriever. None of them realized that the calm moment unfolding near the maple tree carried a story much deeper than anyone could see. Daniel looked down again and let another crumb fall. Instantly, 2 pigeons hopped forward, their wings rustling softly against the grass. "Funny thing about birds," Daniel said slowly, almost as if speaking to himself. "They come back when they know someone means them no harm." Officer Grant frowned, clearly unimpressed. He glanced at the small paper bag in Daniel's hand and then back at the gathering pigeons. What he saw was a minor nuisance. What he didn't see was the quiet patience of the man standing in front of him, a man who had once spent decades wearing the same badge now shining on the officer's chest. But Tyler Grant had no idea who Daniel Brooks was. To him, Daniel was just another older black man standing in the park with a bag of bread and a handful of pigeons circling his feet. And that misunderstanding was about to change everything. Officer Tyler Grant watched the pigeons circle back toward the crumbs with clear irritation, as if the small gray birds themselves were somehow defying him. Daniel Brooks did not hurry. He simply folded the top of the paper bag slightly and rested it in his palm while the morning breeze moved gently through Jefferson Park. The maple leaves above them rustled softly, and somewhere across the walking path a bicycle bell chimed once before fading into the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood waking up. Tyler shifted his weight and looked around, making sure a few people nearby could see that he was handling the situation. Authority, especially new authority, often liked an audience. Daniel seemed completely unaware of the performance. His attention remained on the birds that now formed a loose circle around his shoes, hopping forward one cautious step at a time. One pigeon with a patch of white feathers near its wing moved closest, tilting its head as if studying Daniel's face. Daniel nodded faintly toward it, as though greeting an old friend. He had been coming to this park for almost 7 years now, always around the same time, always carrying the same small bag of bread from Miller's Bakery on the corner of 3rd and Linden. The woman behind the counter there never asked questions anymore. She simply wrapped the leftover pieces in brown paper and smiled when Daniel walked in. Sometimes she would say, "The birds are lucky today." Daniel would answer with the same quiet reply every time. "No, ma'am. I am the lucky one." Officer Grant clearly did not share that perspective. He pointed toward the bench behind Daniel and spoke again with the firm tone he had practiced during training. "You cannot just hang around here all morning. The city has rules about feeding wildlife and loitering in public spaces." Daniel listened politely. He had heard many versions of that voice during his lifetime. Some had been nervous. Some had been confident. Some had been angry. Tyler's voice carried a mixture of impatience and certainty, the sound of someone who believed the badge on his chest explained everything he needed to know about the world. Daniel slowly brushed a few remaining crumbs from his fingers and looked across the open grass where the sun now painted long gold stripes between the trees. For a brief moment, he seemed lost in memory. This park had looked very different decades earlier. Back then the benches had been new, the pathways freshly poured, and the surrounding neighborhood quieter. He remembered walking here in a pressed uniform long. Before the gray touched his hair, he remembered officers greeting him with respect, not because they had to, but because leadership had always been about example rather than volume. But those years had passed quietly into the background of his life, just like the old maple tree that now shaded the bench where he stood. Tyler stepped closer, noticing that Daniel had still not moved. "Did you hear what I said?" the officer asked. Daniel turned back toward him with a calm expression. His eyes carried a thoughtful patience that did not match the tension in Tyler's posture. "Yes, officer," Daniel replied gently. "I heard you." Another pigeon fluttered down from a low branch and landed beside the others, sending a soft ripple through the small flock. The birds trusted the steady rhythm of Daniel's presence more than the sharp tone of the officer nearby. Tyler glanced at the growing cluster of pigeons and shook his head. "You are making a mess here," he said. "People do not want birds everywhere when they come to the park." Daniel considered that statement quietly. Then he gestured lightly toward the open sky above them, where several pigeons were now gliding in slow circles. "Birds have been coming to parks longer than people have," he said in a thoughtful voice. Tyler did not appreciate the comment. To him, the situation was simple. A man was standing where Tyler believed he should not be standing. The officer looked at the paper bag again and then back at Daniel, as though trying to decide whether to push the conversation further. Around them, the park continued its peaceful routine. A dog barked happily somewhere near the fountain. A pair of joggers passed by and glanced briefly in their direction before continuing down the path. None of them knew that the quiet man with the breadcrumbs had once been responsible for guiding an entire department of officers across the city. And none of them realized that the young officer standing in front of him was about to learn something far more important than any rule written in a handbook. Officer Tyler Grant exhaled slowly through his nose, the way someone does when patience is beginning to run thin. The calm tone in Daniel Brooks's voice seemed to irritate him even more than open defiance would have. To Tyler, authority worked best when people responded quickly and without discussion. The older man standing in front of him did neither. Daniel simply remained where he was, relaxed but attentive, like someone who had learned long ago that rushing a moment rarely improved it. The pigeons continued their slow dance around Daniel's shoes, pecking at the crumbs with quick little movements while their wings rustled softly against the grass. A light breeze moved across the park again, carrying the scent of cut grass and warm sunlight. Tyler placed his hands on his duty belt and took another step forward. The small metal pieces on his uniform caught the morning light, reflecting bright flashes against the green lawn. "I am going to need to see some identification," he said firmly. The request hung in the air between them for a moment. Daniel did not look surprised. In fact, the expression on his face suggested he had expected that exact sentence sooner or later. Slowly, he reached into the inside pocket of his worn brown jacket. The motion was calm and deliberate, the kind of careful movement that communicated patience rather than resistance. The pigeons scattered briefly as his arm moved, then returned again when they saw the crumbs still falling from his fingers. Tyler watched closely. To him, every motion carried potential meaning. That was how he had been trained. But what he saw was simply an older man retrieving a simple leather wallet that had clearly been used for many years. The edges were softened from time, and the stitching had faded slightly. Daniel opened it carefully and glanced down for a moment, as if checking something familiar inside. For a brief second, his thumb brushed against a small metal object tucked behind one of the inner pockets. The edge of it caught the sunlight, producing a faint glint before the wallet shifted again. Tyler did not notice the detail. His attention remained fixed on the expectation that the older man should comply quickly. Around them, a few more people had begun to drift closer along the walking path. They were not gathering intentionally, but curiosity has a quiet gravity. When a uniformed officer speaks sharply in a peaceful park, people tend to slow down without realizing it. A man walking his dog paused near the fountain and looked in their direction. Two women jogging together lowered their pace slightly as they passed the maple tree. None of them spoke. They simply watched. Daniel removed a small card from the wallet and held it loosely between his fingers. Instead of handing it over immediately, he studied Officer Grant for a moment. The younger man's shoulders were stiff, his jaw tight, his eyes focused with the certainty of someone who believed he was correcting a problem. Daniel had seen that expression many times during his life. It was the look of someone who thought authority came from standing taller rather than listening longer. "You seem very serious about this," Daniel said quietly. Tyler frowned at the comment. "This is my job," he replied. "And my job is making sure people follow the rules." Daniel nodded slowly, acknowledging the statement without argument. The pigeons gathered closer again, their soft coos blending with the distant hum of a city bus passing along Linden Street beyond the park fence. One bird hopped onto the edge of the bench and watched the exchange with bright, curious eyes. Daniel held the identification card loosely in his hand, but did not rush to present it. Instead, he asked a simple question. "How long have you been wearing that badge, officer?" Tyler blinked once, clearly not expecting the conversation to turn in that direction. "A little over a year," he answered. His tone carried a hint of pride mixed with defensiveness. Daniel studied the badge on Tyler's chest for a moment as the sunlight reflected from its polished surface. Then he looked back up at the young officer's face. There was no judgment in his expression, only a quiet recognition of the long road that came with that piece of metal. Tyler shifted his stance slightly, unsure why the older man's calm presence made the moment feel heavier than it should. "Identification," he repeated, extending his hand. Daniel finally moved his arm forward, holding the card out so that Tyler could take it. But just before the officer reached for it, Daniel paused again, glancing briefly toward the path where more footsteps were approaching from the far side of the park. Somewhere in the distance, a police radio crackled faintly from another patrol unit passing nearby. The sound blended with the flutter of wings overhead as several pigeons lifted into the air and circled back down toward the bench. Tyler Grant still believed he was dealing with a minor nuisance in the park that morning. What he did not realize was that the quiet man handing him that simple piece of identification had once carried the responsibility of guiding an entire department through moments far more complicated than a handful of birds and a paper bag of bread. Officer Tyler Grant reached forward and took the identification card from Daniel Brooks with a quick motion that suggested he expected the moment to end the conversation. The pigeons fluttered briefly when Tyler stepped closer, then settled again around the crumbs scattered on the grass. Tyler glanced down at the card, his brow tightening slightly as he read the name printed across the front. The morning sunlight reflected off the laminated surface, forcing him to tilt it slightly to see more clearly. Daniel Brooks stood quietly while the officer examined it, his hands now empty except for the folded paper bag that rested lightly against his palm. Around them the park remained peaceful. A soft breeze moved through the tall grass near the path, and the distant sound of a lawn sprinkler clicking somewhere beyond the fence echoed faintly through the quiet neighborhood. Tyler studied the card longer than expected, turning it over once before looking back at Daniel with a skeptical expression. "This says you live 3 blocks from here," he said. That means you should know the city discourages feeding birds in public areas. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without urgency. I have lived nearby for a long time, he replied. Tyler handed the card back, but did not step away. Instead, he folded his arms again and looked at the paper bag in Daniel's hand. You cannot just ignore the rules because you feel like doing something peaceful, he continued. The city keeps parks clean for everyone. Daniel accepted the identification card and placed it carefully back inside his wallet before slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket. The movement was slow and thoughtful, the kind of motion that suggested he respected small routines. One of the pigeons hopped closer again, pecking at a crumb near the toe of Daniel's shoe. Daniel watched it for a moment and then looked up at the young officer. Clean parks are important, he said quietly, but sometimes patience keeps things cleaner than force. Tyler frowned at the response, clearly unsure what the older man meant by that. To him, the situation was still simple. A man was feeding birds despite being told not to. Tyler glanced around again and noticed several people now lingering along the path. They were not interfering, but their attention was obvious. A man with a golden retriever had stopped near the drinking fountain, and the dog sat calmly beside him while its owner watched the exchange. Two joggers had slowed to a walk, pretending to stretch while quietly observing the conversation beneath the maple tree. The quiet audience made Tyler slightly more rigid in his posture. I am giving you a chance to cooperate, he said firmly. Please pack up the food and move along. Daniel considered the request. He looked down at the pigeons that still circled patiently near the crumbs and then glanced across the open park where sunlight now filled the space between the trees. For a moment his expression softened with memory. You know, he said slowly, when people rush a situation, they often miss what is really happening. Tyler shook his head, clearly unimpressed. What is happening is that you are ignoring a direct request from a police officer, he replied. Daniel nodded again, accepting the statement calmly. He reached into the paper bag and let a few final crumbs fall gently onto the grass. The pigeons fluttered their wings with soft excitement, gathering quickly around the new pieces of bread. Tyler took a half step forward as if preparing to repeat the command more firmly. But before he could speak again, a distant sound carried across the park. It was the faint crackle of a police radio coming from a patrol vehicle passing along Linden Street, just beyond the fence. The voice over the radio was too far away to understand clearly, but the sound was unmistakable. Daniel's eyes lifted briefly toward the street, and something about the distant radio noise seemed to stir an old familiarity in him. Tyler noticed the glance and followed it for a moment before returning his attention to Daniel. Last warning, he said. Pack up the food. Daniel looked back at the young officer with the same quiet patience he had carried since the beginning of the encounter. The pigeons fluttered softly around his feet, while the morning sun warmed the grass beneath them. Daniel folded the paper bag slowly and held it against his side. Then he spoke again in the same calm voice. Young officer, he said, gently, have you ever noticed that the birds in this park recognize the difference between someone who is protecting the peace and someone who is disturbing it? Tyler stared at him, unsure how to respond to the comment. For the first time since stepping out of his patrol car, a small hint of uncertainty crossed his expression. The quiet man in front of him was not reacting the way people usually did when confronted by authority. Daniel Brooks remained completely composed, standing beneath the maple tree with the same steady presence he had carried through decades of experience. Tyler still believed he was correcting a minor problem in the park that morning, but the calm confidence in the older man's voice was beginning to make the moment feel far more complicated than it had only a few minutes earlier. Officer Tyler Grant stood rigid beneath the maple tree, his eyes narrowing slightly as Daniel Brooks finished speaking. The pigeons continued circling calmly around Daniel's shoes, their soft cooing filling the quiet space that followed the older man's words. Tyler did not like the way the conversation felt. The man in front of him was not arguing, not raising his voice, not challenging him in the usual ways people did when confronted by authority. Instead, Daniel spoke with a calm certainty that made Tyler feel as though he had stepped into the middle of a conversation he did not fully understand. Tyler glanced once more toward the small group of people watching from the walking path. The man with the golden retriever had not moved, and the dog now sat perfectly still beside him, its ears perked forward. The two joggers stood a few yards away pretending to stretch their legs, but their attention remained fixed on the scene beneath the tree. The quiet audience added a subtle pressure that Tyler could feel settling into his shoulders. He cleared his throat and spoke again, this time louder than before. "Sir, I have asked you more than once to stop feeding the birds and move along," he said. "You are choosing to ignore a direct instruction from a police officer." Daniel Brooks did not respond immediately. He watched the pigeons finish the last few crumbs scattered across the grass. One small bird fluttered up onto the bench beside him, tilting its head with curious patience. Daniel gave the bird a faint smile, before turning back toward the officer. "I hear what you are saying," he replied calmly. Tyler gestured toward the paper bag again, his voice growing sharper. "Then you should follow the instruction." Daniel looked down at the folded bag in his hand and brushed a few remaining crumbs from his fingertips. The motion was slow and thoughtful, as though he had no intention of rushing the moment. Tyler interpreted the calm movement as refusal. His posture stiffened even further. "If you continue to ignore the instruction, I will have to escalate the situation," he said firmly. Daniel raised his eyes again, studying the young officer's face. There was no anger in his expression, only the quiet observation of someone who had spent many years watching how people responded to pressure. "Escalate," Daniel repeated gently. Tyler nodded once. "Yes, I can call another unit and issue a formal citation for violating park regulations." The pigeons fluttered briefly when Tyler shifted his stance again, but they quickly returned to their calm circle near Daniel's feet. Daniel glanced toward the birds and then back at the officer. "It is interesting," he said slowly, "how quickly a peaceful moment can turn complicated." Tyler's jaw tightened. "It does not need to be complicated," he replied. "You just need to move along." Daniel considered the words for a moment. Then he looked across the park again, watching the sunlight move through the branches above the path. A distant city bus passed along Linden Street, its low rumble echoing faintly through the open space. The world around them continued calmly, unaware of the tension that had quietly built beneath the maple tree. Daniel turned back toward Tyler and spoke again in the same steady tone. "Young officer, when you approach a situation, do you ever pause to ask yourself why someone might be standing where they are?" Tyler frowned. "That is not the point," he said quickly. Daniel nodded slightly, as though acknowledging that the officer believed that. The man with the golden retriever shifted his weight nearby, clearly sensing that the moment had grown more serious. The dog remained seated, watching quietly. Tyler lifted his radio slightly, resting his hand on it, as though preparing to make a call. The small movement was enough to catch the attention of the bystanders along the path. Daniel noticed the gesture as well, but his expression remained completely calm. He simply folded the paper bag once more and held it loosely against his side. "You are welcome to call anyone you feel you need to call," Daniel said gently. Tyler hesitated for half a second. Something about the older man's confidence made the simple situation feel heavier than it should have been. Still, he pressed the button on his radio microphone. A faint burst of static crackled through the small speaker before Tyler began speaking into it. The pigeons fluttered upward for a moment at the sound, and then settled again around Daniel's feet. The quiet man beneath the maple tree did not react at all. Daniel Brooks simply stood there, watching the young officer with the same patient expression, as if he already knew exactly how the next few minutes were going to unfold. The brief crackle of static from Officer Tyler Grant's radio faded into the morning air as he lowered the microphone slightly, waiting for a response from dispatch. The pigeons lifted in a small swirl above the grass at the sudden burst of sound, their wings brushing the air like soft paper before settling again around Daniel Brooks. Daniel did not move. He stood quietly beneath the maple tree with the folded paper bag resting against his palm, watching the birds with the same patient calm he had carried since the moment the patrol car rolled into the park. Around them the quiet audience had grown slightly larger. The man with the golden retriever remained near the fountain, the leash loose in his hand as the dog sat calmly at his side. Two elderly women walking along the path had slowed their pace, their conversation fading as they looked toward the scene beneath the tree. None of them spoke. They simply watched with the quiet curiosity that draws people towards small moments of tension in otherwise peaceful places. Tyler shifted his weight again, trying to ignore the feeling that the situation had somehow slipped outside the simple routine he expected when stepping out of his patrol car earlier that morning. To him, this had started as a straightforward enforcement of park rules. Yet the calm presence of the older man standing in front of him had slowly changed the tone of the encounter. Daniel Brooks looked less like someone causing trouble and more like someone observing a lesson unfolding in real time. The radio on. Tyler's shoulder crackled again, with faint static, but no clear response. He frowned slightly and adjusted the volume knob before releasing the microphone button. "Dispatch must be busy," he muttered under his breath. Daniel glanced briefly toward the radio, and then back to the birds. A small pigeon hopped onto the edge of the bench again, peering up at him with curious eyes. Daniel bent slightly at the waist and brushed a final tiny crumb from the tip of his finger onto the grass near the bird's feet. The pigeon fluttered down immediately and began pecking at the crumb with quick movements. Tyler noticed the motion and shook his head again. "You still think this is a joke?" he said with a trace of irritation in his voice. Daniel straightened slowly and met the officer's eyes. "No," he replied calmly. "I think this is a moment." Tyler blinked, clearly unsure what the older man meant by that. A light breeze drifted through the park again, carrying the sound of a distant siren somewhere far across the city streets. The maple leaves rustled overhead, scattering patches of sunlight across the grass between them. For a few seconds neither man spoke. The pigeons shifted quietly, their wings brushing against one another as they gathered around the last crumbs on the ground. Daniel looked across the park again, his gaze drifting briefly toward the street beyond the iron fence, where cars passed slowly through the morning traffic. "Do you enjoy this work?" he asked after a moment. Tyler frowned at the question. "What does that have to do with anything?" Daniel shrugged slightly. "Sometimes asking the right question helps people see the situation more clearly." Tyler gave a short breath of frustration. "The situation is already clear," he replied. "You are refusing to follow instructions." Daniel nodded slowly, as if considering the statement. The quiet confidence in his posture remained unchanged, and that calm steadiness seemed to frustrate the young officer even more. Tyler lifted the radio again, preparing to call dispatch a second time. But just as his thumb moved toward the microphone button, another sound reached them from the far side of the park. It was the low rumble of a second patrol vehicle turning onto the street along the fence. The distant engine noise rolled through the morning air for a moment before fading again as the vehicle slowed near. The corner. Tyler paused slightly, glancing toward the street before returning his attention to Daniel. The older man seemed to have noticed the sound as well, but his expression did not change. He simply rested his hands loosely at his sides and watched the pigeons circling the bench with quiet familiarity. "You seem very certain about how this will end," Tyler said. Daniel gave a faint smile that carried no arrogance, only quiet understanding. "Experience teaches patience," he said softly. Tyler stared at him for a moment, unsure how to interpret the calm remark. The breeze moved again through the branches above them, and the pigeons lifted into the air once more before settling back onto the grass in a soft ripple of wings. In the stillness that followed, Daniel Brooks remained exactly where he had been since the encounter began, standing peacefully beneath the maple tree, while the young officer slowly realized that the quiet man feeding birds might know far more about authority than he did. The low rumble of the patrol vehicle grew louder for a moment before the car came into view beyond the iron fence along Linden Street. Its engine slowed as it rolled past the park entrance, sunlight flashing briefly across the windshield. Officer Tyler Grant glanced toward the street again, expecting the car to continue down the block. Instead, the vehicle turned slowly into the small service lane that bordered Jefferson Park. Tyler straightened slightly, instinctively adjusting his stance. The quiet audience along the walking path noticed the movement as well. The man with the golden retriever turned his head toward the approaching patrol car, while the two joggers stepped aside near the edge of the path. The engine of the second cruiser idled for a moment before the driver's door opened. A tall officer stepped out, older than Tyler by at least 20 years, with a calm posture that suggested long experience in the field. His nameplate caught the sunlight as he closed the door behind him. Sergeant Mark Ellis. He scanned the park quickly before his eyes settled on the scene beneath the maple tree. The pigeons fluttered softly across the grass as he approached, their wings brushing the air in quiet ripples. Tyler gave a small nod when he saw the sergeant walking toward them. "Morning, Sergeant," Tyler said, trying to keep his voice steady. Ellis nodded in return but did not answer immediately. His attention had already shifted toward the older man standing calmly beside the bench. Daniel Brooks had not moved. He simply watched the approaching officer with the same relaxed expression he had carried all morning. The pigeons gathered again near his feet, pecking quietly at the last tiny crumbs in the grass. Ellis slowed his pace as he came closer. For a brief second his eyes narrowed slightly, as if something about the older man's face stirred a distant memory. He stopped about 6 feet away and studied Daniel more carefully. Tyler began speaking first. "I was just handling a situation involving park regulations," he explained. "This gentleman refused to stop feeding the birds." Ellis barely seemed to hear the explanation. His attention remained fixed on Daniel's face. The breeze moved gently through the maple leaves above them, scattering sunlight across the grass in shifting patterns. Daniel met the sergeant's gaze calmly. For a moment neither man spoke. Then Ellis blinked once, the recognition arriving slowly but unmistakably. His posture changed instantly. The relaxed stance of a patrol sergeant shifted into something more formal. "Sir?" Ellis said quietly. Tyler frowned slightly, confused by the sudden change in tone. Ellis stepped closer, his expression sharpening with certainty. "Chief Brooks." The words hung in the air like a bell echoing across the quiet park. The pigeons fluttered upward briefly before settling again. Daniel gave a small nod, neither proud nor surprised. "Good morning, Mark," he replied gently. Tyler's eyes widened slightly as he turned toward Daniel again. "Chief," he repeated under his breath, unsure if he had heard correctly. Ellis straightened his shoulders and spoke with clear respect. "Daniel Brooks," he said, "former chief of police for this entire city." The quiet statement moved through the small crowd like a ripple through still water. The man with the golden retriever shifted his stance while the joggers exchanged surprised glances. Tyler stood completely still. His mind tried to process the words while the pieces of the morning rearranged themselves all at once. The calm voice, the patience, the way the older man had spoken about the badge. Daniel Brooks remained exactly where he had been since the beginning of the encounter. The folded paper bag rested lightly in his hand while the pigeons circled his shoes once more. Tyler looked down at the badge on his own uniform, then back at the man standing beneath the maple tree. The sudden realization settled heavily in his chest. The quiet man he had been ordering around in the park that morning had once worn the highest badge in the department Tyler now served. The words spoken by Sergeant Mark Ellis lingered in the quiet air beneath the maple tree, and for a few seconds no one moved. Officer Tyler Grant stood frozen where he was, the meaning of the moment settling slowly into his mind. The calm man he had been speaking to all morning was not simply an older resident enjoying a peaceful routine. Daniel Brooks had once been the man whose decisions shaped the entire department Tyler now served. The pigeons circled once above the grass before settling again near Daniel's shoes, completely unaware that the atmosphere in the park had changed. Sergeant Ellis straightened slightly and gave a respectful nod. "It has been a long time, sir," he said. Daniel Brooks returned the nod gently. "It has," he replied. His voice remained calm, exactly as it had been from the beginning. The breeze moved through the maple leaves again, scattering shifting patches of sunlight across the ground. Tyler looked from the sergeant to Daniel and then back again. His earlier confidence had faded into a quiet uncertainty. "Chief, I did not realize," he said slowly, his voice no longer sharp. Daniel shook his head lightly, not dismissing the moment, but easing the tension. "You were not supposed to," he said. The small audience along the path had grown silent. The man with the golden retriever watched with raised eyebrows while the joggers stood still a few yards away. Tyler glanced down briefly at the badge on his chest, and then back at Daniel. The badge suddenly felt heavier than it had earlier that morning. "I was only trying to enforce the park rules," Tyler said, the words sounding less certain now. Daniel studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than critical. "I understand," he replied. Sergeant Ellis remained quiet, allowing the conversation to unfold. Daniel took a small step toward the bench and rested his hand lightly on its weathered wooden back. One pigeon hopped onto the seat beside him, tilting its head as if waiting for another crumb. Daniel smiled faintly at the bird before speaking again. "When you wear that badge," he said gently, "people see more than the medal." Tyler listened carefully now. The earlier tension had given way to something closer to reflection. Daniel continued in the same steady voice. They see judgment. They see authority. And sometimes they see fear. Tyler shifted slightly, but did not interrupt. Daniel looked across the park for a moment, watching a pair of children ride bicycles along the far path, while their father walked beside them. Authority does not come from telling people to move, Daniel said quietly. It comes from understanding why they are standing still. The pigeons fluttered softly again, their wings brushing the air like quiet applause for the moment. Tyler lowered his eyes briefly, considering the words. Sergeant Ellis folded his arms calmly, but kept his gaze respectful toward the retired chief. You have always had a way of explaining things clearly, sir, Ellis said. Daniel chuckled softly. Experience gives you time to learn, he replied. Tyler looked back up again, meeting Daniel's eyes for the first time without the earlier tension. I am sorry if I handled the situation poorly, he said. Daniel shook his head again, this time with a faint smile. You handled it the way a young officer often does, he said. Direct and certain. The breeze moved once more through the branches overhead. Sunlight glimmered across the grass while the pigeons gathered calmly at Daniel's feet again. The real lesson, Daniel continued, is that the badge is not there to control people. It is there to protect the peace around them. Tyler nodded slowly. The quiet words carried more weight than any command he had heard during training. Daniel unfolded the paper bag again and released one last tiny piece of bread onto the grass. The pigeon beside the bench hopped down quickly to claim it. Then Daniel turned back toward the two officers, his expression calm and kind. And sometimes, he added gently, protecting the peace means allowing a simple moment to remain peaceful. The quiet words Daniel Brooks had spoken seemed to settle gently across Jefferson Park like the soft breeze moving through the maple leaves overhead. For a few moments no one spoke. The pigeons gathered calmly near Daniel's shoes, pecking at the final crumbs scattered across the grass, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The sunlight had climbed higher now, warming the open lawn and casting long golden shadows from the trees along the walking path. Officer Tyler Grant stood still beside Sergeant Mark Ellis, the weight of the moment resting quietly in his chest. The badge on his uniform no longer felt like a symbol of authority alone. It felt like a reminder of responsibility. Tyler glanced toward Daniel again, studying the calm expression of the man who had once carried the same responsibility on a much larger scale. Thank you for the reminder, sir, Tyler said finally, his voice quieter than it had been earlier. Daniel gave a small nod, not as a superior correcting a subordinate, but as an older man acknowledging that a lesson had been heard. Sergeant Ellis shifted his stance slightly and allowed a faint smile to appear. The department could still use your perspective sometimes, Ellis said. Daniel chuckled softly and looked around the park again. The man with the golden retriever had begun walking slowly along the path again, the dog trotting happily beside him. The two joggers exchanged a few quiet words before continuing their run toward the far end of the park. The quiet crowd that had gathered was dissolving back into the normal rhythm of the morning. Daniel looked down at the pigeons once more. A small gray bird fluttered up onto the edge of the bench again and watched him with bright, curious eyes. Daniel brushed his hands together gently, clearing the last traces of bread crumbs from his fingertips. The birds know something people often forget, he said thoughtfully. Tyler listened carefully now, no longer impatient to end the conversation. What is that? He asked. Daniel glanced at the pigeon beside the bench, and then back toward the open sky, where a few birds circled lazily above the trees. Peace does not need to be commanded, Daniel said softly. It grows when people allow it space. The breeze moved through the park again, lifting a few loose feathers from the grass as the pigeons fluttered briefly and then settled once more. Tyler nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Sergeant Ellis gave a respectful incline of his head toward Daniel. It was good seeing you again, Chief, he said. Daniel smiled faintly at the title, but did not linger on it. Just Daniel is fine these days, he replied. Tyler shifted his stance again and glanced toward the patrol car waiting along the park lane. The urgency he had felt earlier that morning had completely disappeared. In its place was a quiet understanding that authority did not always mean acting quickly. Sometimes it meant stepping back and recognizing the difference between a disturbance and a peaceful moment. Daniel folded the empty paper bag neatly and slipped it into the pocket of his jacket. The pigeons lingered for a moment longer before gradually drifting away across the grass, their wings lifting them gently into the morning sky. Tyler watched them rise, noticing for the first time how calm the park truly felt. The laughter of children echoed faintly from the playground across the lawn, and the distant hum of traffic blended with the rustling leaves overhead. Daniel rested his hand briefly on the back of the bench before stepping away from it. He gave a small nod to both officers. "Enjoy the rest of your morning," he said kindly. Tyler nodded back with quiet respect. "You too, sir." Daniel began walking slowly along the path toward the far side of the park, his steps steady and unhurried. The pigeons circled once above the maple tree before following their own quiet paths across the open sky. Tyler remained where he stood for a moment, watching the older man disappear among the trees. Then he looked down at the badge on his uniform once more. For the first time since the encounter began, he understood something that training manuals could never fully explain. Respect was